Greetings and welcome to the introduction on the newly launched Simplified Approval Process of the Green Climate Fund, brought to you by the GCF in collaboration with the United Nations Institute for Research and Training, UNITAR. My name is Ana Maria Kleymeier, and I will be your facilitator for today, working with a wonderful GCF team of presenters and engaging with the audience, all of you who have joined us for this event. To launch, I would like to invite Demetrio Innocenti, the manager of the Simplified Approval Process at the GCF, to give some opening remarks. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Demetrio. Thanks for being here, and I give the floor to you to start us off.
Thank you very much, Ana Maria, and good morning to all of you. If you are in Africa or Europe, good afternoon or good evening or good night if you are in other regions of the world. My name, is Demetrio Innocenti, and I'm the manager of the Simplified Approval Process. On behalf of the Green Climate Fund, I would like to welcome all the participants, the representative of the national designated authorities and focal points to GCF, the accredited entities, the board members and advisors, the GCF observers who might have joined this webinar, and all of you partners and individual professionals who are taking the time to know more about the Simplified Approval Process pilot scheme. From now on, I will refer to this as the SAP. Our moderator, Ana Maria, shortly will give you the details on the agenda, and my colleagues, Jenny, Leo, and Patrick from the GCF Secretariat will be our panelists for the sessions to come. On my side, I would like to emphasize that I'm very pleased to see this good level of attendance. This webinar actually has been already proposed in different time zones twice to cover during business hours, America and Asia Pacific. And so I would say that we truly look forward to an active and interactive discussion with all of you. We are eager to hear your questions, your comments, and we truly welcome any constructive inputs and feedback that you might have for us. Actually, we just started the SAP, and we are currently in its pilot phase. We have lessons to learn from countries, from the accredited entities that are presenting SAP projects, and from all of you as partners and professionals of the Green Climate Fund, working in different sectors, in different organizations dealing with climate change. Our work is not only to deploy climate finance through the SAP modality, but at this stage is foremost to help our board to shape a better and meaningful SAP process that can rapidly and effectively respond to the urgent needs posed by climate change, both in adaptation and mitigation. Let me say that our vision is to increase the effectiveness of the climate finance that GCF is providing to developing countries. This can be done through a process which is faster in approving project, is less burdensome for our accredited entities and the countries in terms of preparation requirements. So let me say that simplifying the different stages of the preparation and approval of a GCF project is actually not a simple endeavor. Simplifying does not mean that we are making this approval process simplistic. It does not mean either that we can compromise on the quality that we expect from the project proposals submitted to GCF as SAP projects. A requirement for all project proposals to be eligible for the SAP is that they should demonstrate potential to be transformational. We look forward to receiving climate projects that, while maintaining low levels of environmental and social risks, are promoting low emission and climate resilience development pathways. Let me also say that country ownership is at the center of any SAP intervention. We expect that SAP projects actively support countries towards their commitments to the Paris Agreement and their climate policies, their national strategies on climate change, such as the national adaptation plans. So said that, I really wish to all of you a productive and most of all enjoyable webinar with the Green Climate Fund and UNITAR. And with this, over to you, Ana Maria.
Thank you for that warm welcome, Demetrio. So I would like to just go through a few housekeeping points before we begin, and we will be coming back to Demetrio at the end of the session. There will be ample time to converse with him and ask him questions if you like. A few things just to make this webinar easier and more enjoyable for everyone. The audio is best when you are able to use earphones or headset. You'll be muted during the webinar, but you'll be able to ask questions by utilizing the handouts tab that's in the control, oh, sorry, not the handouts tab, the questions tab that's in the control panel. So feel free to ask any question, whether technical or substantive, in that questions box. And we see that some of you have already begun to use it, and you're welcome to ask as many questions as necessary. If you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, you can pose a question to our staff. We have some technical support, and they'll try to resolve it by answering you as soon as possible directly to your question. The technical staff for this session is Elena from UNITAR, and I thank her for all of the support she'll be giving us. If for some reason you lose connection during the webinar, you can just re-enter by using the same access link that you utilized in getting initially connected with us. In a follow-up email, we will share with you a link to the recorded session of the webinar that you can share with other colleagues, or if you'd like to see the webinar again. And we will also be sharing with you some follow-up information that's relevant to the questions that were asked throughout the webinar, and also ways to obtain more information from the GCF SAP team. There will be a consolidation of answers to your questions, and you will also receive answers directly from the presenters throughout the webinar, and if there's insufficient time to get to all the questions during the webinar itself, then you'll get an answer later on. So rest assured that all of your questions will be answered quite soon. Finally, everyone should have access to the agenda and the PowerPoint presentation that you'll see in a PDF format in the Handouts tab. That's also in the control panel. I also wanted to mention that you may post your questions either in English, Spanish, or French, and we will be answering for the benefit of the group in English. But feel free, if you're more comfortable, to ask your questions in either of those three languages. Now I'd like to just take a couple more moments to do a short poll so that we can get a sense of who is in the audience with us today. I'll be asking 3 questions, and they will appear on your screen as a pop-up, and you just answer in the designated circle, and then that'll give us a little bit better idea, give us all a better idea of who is out there. So the first question that we have for you is let us know where you are joining us from today. Are you in the Africa region, in European area? Are you joining us from the Americas, from Asia, or from one of the other regions? I'll give you a moment just to answer in the designated spot. And then now perhaps we can pull up the answers, and so I can let you know where everyone, where everyone is from today. So nearly 25% of the participants of you all are from the Africa region, 64% from Europe, only 2% from the Americas at this webinar, but I believe they joined more in greater numbers at the other webinar that we had, and 11% from Asia. So those are the 4 regions that are represented. Our second question is, we'd like to know what your affiliation is in relation to the GCF. Do you work with an accredited entity that is an international accredited entity? Do you work with a direct access accredited entity in one of the countries? Or perhaps you are with one of the national designated authorities or a focal point for the GCF. Another option is that you work at an institution that's a GCF observer, and perhaps none of those, and so you can just put other, and perhaps either in the comments at the end, let us know where you're joining us from if you're not in one of the 4 initial sectors, so that we know where everyone is, where the interest is coming from. So let's take a look at the answers to that poll and see where this group falls. 41% of the group is from an international accredited entity, 2% from direct access accredited entities, 7% of you all are from either a national designated authority or a focal point, 11% are GCF observers, and nearly 40% are from other types of institutions. Excellent. Our last question for you this morning before we begin the presentations is just to get a little bit of a sense of how familiar you are with the SAP or the SAP process. Yeah, either no experience and knowledge at all of the simplified approval process, maybe a little bit, you've done some research or heard something about it, but not that familiar with the details, or you have quite a bit of knowledge and you're interested in kind of getting the most recent developments and polishing up so that you are up to speed on all of the recent developments. So let's take a look and see the range of experience. 39% of the group has no experience as of yet with the simplified approval process. So welcome to you all, to the newcomers. 50% have some background, and 11% know the process quite well and are just getting up to speed. Well, that's great. So welcome to everyone. Doesn't matter how much you know, I think there will be new information for everyone at every level of experience with the SAP and the GCF. And we look forward to also getting your questions as they relate to the work you do in your particular areas of interest. So now I'd like to invite our first speaker, Gianni Ryu. Gianni is the Agriculture and Food Security Senior Specialist at the Green Climate Fund Secretariat. Gianni, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you very much for being here. And I'd like to turn the mic over to you for your presentation as you start us off with the substantive part of our webinar. Thanks, and it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Ana Maria. Okay, so, well, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us online. We're really pleased to see your interest to hear more about the SAP. I've been engaged on the SAP since its approval and supported the launch and initial reviews. So it's great to be engaging with you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. And please don't hesitate to write your questions, any question you might have in the chat box. So let's start. This presentation is a bit of the background presentation on SAP. So the SAP objective, the SAP pilot scheme has a well-defined objective. It intends to apply best practices that can support the reduction of time and effort needed for the preparation of the funding proposals from the accredited entities, for the review of the proposals by the GCF Secretariat and the UNITAR, which is the Independent Technical Advisory Panel, for the approval of the funding proposals by the GCF Board, and for entering into the disbursement phase once the funding proposals are approved. So the SAP is a learning process, which includes a review period the review seeks to improve and further simplify the different stages of the proposal approval process. So the overall goal at the end of the pilot is to have a full-scale, mainstream, simplified project cycle that will generate high-quality projects while simplifying the project preparation requirement and the review process, thus reducing the approval time of a funding proposal. This is a picture of the SAP pilot scheme launch, which took place during COP23 in Bonn in November 2017. And the key message from the launch was that the SAP pilot scheme is a recognition that more needs to be done to facilitate fast approval of smaller projects, especially from direct access entities. This is a bit of a timeline in regard to the SAP from its approval in October 2017. And if you want to read the decision, it's B1806. And this, the pilot scheme has been approved with this review period, which means that the SAP will be reviewed after 2 years from its launch, or when the amount of funding proposal approved will reach 80 million of GCF financing. In November 2017, the SAP was launched at the COP23, and a SAP concept note template was developed, and that really opened the SAP for business to receive concept note from the accredited entities and NDAs. The first SAP funding proposal was approved in March 2018, and this project is from the Environmental Investment Fund of Namibia, and their experience will be presented later in this webinar. As of May 2018, we have in the SAP pipeline 2 funding proposals under review and also 11 concept notes that were submitted by accredited entities and NDAs. Also, the SAP funding proposal template was launched last week, and we are also conducting that first series of webinars and collaboration with UNITAR. So that's really to build awareness and capacity building on SAPs. In regard to the SAP pipeline in terms of funding, this is of course indicative and includes all the concept note and funding proposals that are eligible for SAP. The concept notes are at different stages of readiness to become funding proposals. So this pipeline is indicative, but still we can see that total SAP proposal are 188 million, of which they require 120 million of GCF finance. So it shows really a strong interest in the SAP since its approval. Now you can see the eligibility criteria of SAP. So the first one is the SAP targets projects or programs that are ready for scaling up and have the potential for transformation, promoting a paradigm shift to low emission and climate resilient development. An elaboration of how the project is building and scaling up adaptation and mitigation action should be reported at the level of concept note, along with an explanation of what are the transformational aspects. At the level of funding proposal, there should be an explanation of the pathway to transformation through a theory of change, especially in relation to the GCF investment criteria of paradigm shift. The second criterion is about the amount of GCF finance available for SAP project, which is up to 10 million of GCF contribution. So the total project size can be larger, including the co-financing, but the GCF contribution is up to 10 million. Also, all types of financing instruments can be used in SAP. So grant, loan, all the other financing instruments that are available through GCF. The third one, projects or programs whose environmental and social risk and impacts are classified as minimal to none or eligible for SAP. So examples of activities that can be considered within this ESS category or capacity development, advisory services, household and community level activities, such as micro-scale renewable energy, agroforestry, small-scale climate resilient agriculture, as well as early warning and monitoring system. So if proposed projects and programs have known risk factors, they're not eligible for the SAP pilot. More on ESS will be explained in the next presentation by my colleague. If we look at the other criteria, let's say, around the SAP pilot concept notes can be submitted only by entities accredited to GCF and by the national designated authorities and focal point. So organizations that are not accredited to GCF, but that are interested to develop SAP pilot funding proposal are encouraged to discuss with the NDA focal points and to explore partnership with existing accredited entities. National designated authorities and focal point can submit concept notes, but for funding proposal submission, they should identify and bring forward the proposal with an accredited entity. The SAP pilot is geared towards increasing direct access modality. Pilot requires at least 50% of the funding proposal submitted to be from direct access accredited entities. And during the review period, I would like to see diversity in sectors and accredited entities. So that's something that we look forward. In terms of the concept note preparation, unlike the standard process for funding proposal, the submission of the concept note for the SAP is compulsory. This is the stage where the compliance with the eligibility criteria is checked, and discussion with the GCF Secretariat specialists on the potential of a concept note to become a funding proposal is taking place. So that is where the eligibility for SAP is confirmed and validated by the GCF Secretariat. The SAP concept note should be accompanied by a self-assessed screening of the potential environment and social risk. And this self-assessment is guided by the Annex 1 of the SAP concept note template. Now moving to the funding proposal preparation. The GCF Secretariat just published last week a simplified template for the SAP funding proposal. So this template will further reduce the time for the project preparation and review. And we hope that by the end of the year, the template will be available as an online submission, an online entry. So once confirmed that a proposal is eligible for SAP, the GCF specialists will work with the accredited entities to explore which type of documentation and studies is essential and what can be simplified compared to standard funding proposal. Given the specificity of every sector, the SAP pilot will gather lessons learned on the simplification of the preparation process that will be included in the SAP review and future SAP guidelines. So here in summary, you can see the 4 areas where the SAP intends to work in order to simplify the entire proposal approval process and also some elements of the post-approval. So the simplification of the documents needed for the preparation. So this relates to the SAP funding proposal template, which simplifies the amount of information and length required compared to the standard funding proposal template. And the GCF Secretariat is also planning to develop by early next year guidelines that will describe examples of how a SAP project in a given sector of GCF operations should be prepared and which documents are necessary and which ones are not. The Secretariat in coordination with ITAP would also explore what are the parts of the review process that could be further simplified. So that could include, for example, a simplified assessment summary template. And the current business model for the standard funding proposal, the ITAP review is following the board cycles. For the SAP, it is proposed that the ITAP will review the SAP pilot funding proposals on a rolling basis, while the board could also take a decision in between board meetings once this modality is approved. So the combination of these 2 elements will accelerate the overall approval time of the SAP compared to the standard funding proposal. So this is the link to the SAP website when you can find the concept note and funding proposal templates, as well as the SAP brief, which is available in English, French, and Spanish, and all the other currently available information, including the ESS guidelines. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for that very useful and detailed presentation. I think it lays everything out quite clearly. And we have a number of specific questions that have come in from our audience that I'd like to pose to you. The first question is from Boris, and he's writing to us from Cameroon. He says, not all countries in the world have a registered direct access accredited entity that covers them. One example is Cameroon, where I'm writing from. Can an international or non-direct access accredited entity submit a process via the SAP? I'll put that question in your hands.
Great, thank you, Ana Maria. This is a very important question to clarify. Basically, the SAP is open to all accredited entities, but there's a target to increase direct access, which is over time we would wish to have 50% of the SAP approved projects from direct access entity. So another 50% can come from international accredited entities, and this is especially for this situation in which many countries do not yet have a direct access entities. So it's so yes, it can be from all accredited entities. But yes, I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. Another brief question regarding the second eligibility criteria, the limit of US $10 million. The question is this limit for the entirety of the project or just for each sub-project? I leave it to you, Jenny.
So this is the GCF contribution on the project. So it's up to 10 million of GCF contribution, but with the co-financing, the project size can be larger.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. Next question is, what is the definition of a transformational impact? Could you please provide an example for the water or agriculture sectors?
No, thanks. This is Demetrio. I can take this. Let me say that transformational impact in GCF terminology is also called the paradigm shift project. We normally require the proponent of the SAP, but also not SAP proposal, to tell us what is the theory of change behind that intervention. So, example of what can be transformational in agriculture and water. There are many examples, depends on the scale of the project. For project, let's say on the SAP typology, that exactly we do normally not expect large project. Large project in GCF scale are those projects that are above a total cost of 250 million. So for projects that stays in the micro or small category within 50 million US dollar, example can be that a given province where the GCF intervention is taking place will reduce the use of pollutant and CO2 emitting fertilizers from 40% to 5%, or that drought resistance variety will be introduced so that the impact of droughts in the economy will be reduced with an average impact on the harvest of 15%. So, I mean, these are the ambition targets that I can just say that give us an idea that over time, even after the implementation of the project is taking place, there is an impact that actually is transformational and most of all is sustainable over time. You can also refer to our policy, the investment framework, where for the paradigm shift there are several assessment factors of what constitute a paradigm shift. We look at the possibility of the action to be scalable, to produce behavioral change in the institutions as well as the individuals or the households. These are all elements that make a project transformational according to us. Over to you, Ana Maria.
Thank you, Demetrio. Thank you for that explanation. So another question came up as to whether topics or projects related to public awareness raising and capacity building are eligible for SAP financing. Perhaps, Demetrio, would you like to answer that question as well?
Yes, capacity building and awareness are activities that can be financed by a sub project or by a standard GCF project. Of course, given the level of finance of GCF projects, we normally expect that this capacity building is also compounded with other type of activities that overall make use of capacity building, exactly as I said before, to make the project transformational or to reach output that's sustainable in the long term. So, of course, we would expect that a GCF project, which for a SAP can be 20, 30, or 40 million US dollar even, but even if it's 10, is not entirely capacity building, but definitely the capacity building is instrumental to reach the objective of the project. So yes, can be an activity covered by this type of finance. Over to you.
Thanks, Demetrio. So one last question before we move on to our next section, and if I could come back to Gianni on this question. The question comes from Cape Town, South Africa, and it reads, could it be assumed that a local private sector entity could partner with a direct access entity in order to submit a SAP proposal? Could you speak a little bit to the options and opportunities for the private sector as put to us by this question, Gianni? I put that question to you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Ana Maria. That is a really good question, and indeed, SAP is open for both public and private sector projects. So this is totally feasible that a private sector would partner with a direct access entities accredited to GCF to bring forward a project. The important point is that the project has climate benefits for adaptation and or mitigation. So that's really the end. So if the intervention proposed by the private sector and collaboration with the accredited entity and other relevant stakeholder and partners and the implementation bring those common benefits, then this is totally feasible. And as well, as I've mentioned earlier, in that case, we would expect the financial instruments to be as well for the private sector, more adapted for the private sector, and could include loans and a small share of grant maybe for the capacity building. So that could bring very innovative projects, and we are looking forward those sorts of project design. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Gianni. While you're talking about the different types of actors and stakeholders that can access the SAP, there's another related question, which is how can local governments access or benefit from the SAP? Could you speak a little bit to that option or opportunity?
Yes, thank you. So in that case, yeah, the local government, we assume that they're not accredited to GCF, so basically they can partner with an accredited entity, and then they could be, the local government could be, for example, the executing entity in that project that would implement the different or part of the project activities. So it's totally possible, and that's in a way why SAP was also open as a modality to ensure that those kind of bottom-up climate action, could be bring forward to GCF. So I think that's a really good options for local government to see how to engage. We under SAP there's capacity development, planning support, institutional development types of activities that can be support always, as Demetrio explained, in conjunction with also kind of underground adaptation, mitigation, intervention. So yes.
Okay, thank you so much for giving us a bit more background on that. There are so many fantastic questions coming in, and I'm sure the presenters would love to get to all of them, and they certainly will get to all of them either in writing while the session is being carried out. Each one of you will get an answer to your question, even if if the presenters aren't able to answer them live. So I will be moving on to the next presentation, and keep those questions coming because they're really excellent, and they give our presenters also an opportunity to go a little bit more in depth on each of the subjects that they are bringing for us. Our next expert is Leonardo Pat. Leonardo is the Environmental and Social Safeguards specialist at the GCF. And he will be speaking on this topic and giving us more information about how ESS applies to the SAP procedure. Leonardo, thank you very much for joining us here in the webinar today. We're really looking forward to your presentation. It's a pleasure to have you. So I will pass the microphone to you and look forward to hearing about the ESS.
Thank you very much, Ana Maria, and thank you all for sharing your time. In the next set of slides, we will go through the environmental and social safeguards of the Green Climate Fund, and for us to understand how these safeguards apply to projects proposed for GCF funding under the simplified approval process. Our discussion on safeguards today will hover on general terms, with the aim of providing an overview of the application of safeguards for projects under SAP. If you wish to discuss safeguards in further details, or if you have any issues or questions regarding any specific safeguards of the projects that you're preparing, please reach out to us and we'll be happy to engage. So, what are safeguards? Safeguards are tools that help institutions like GCF manage the environmental and social risks that arise from the operations. For GCF, safeguards allow the integration of the environmental and social considerations into the planning, development, and implementation of GCF-funded projects. As such, safeguards consist of a set of criteria and specifications for what are considered good practices. Safeguards also contain the principles that guide the application of these criteria, and also describes the requirements that will need to be met by the projects. These safeguards requirements include the appropriate environmental and social due diligence for projects proposed for GCF funding, as well as requirements for the implementation, monitoring, and reporting of the environmental and social outcomes of the projects. In this way, safeguards set out the opportunities for GCF and the accredited entities to not only avoid, mitigate, and minimize any potential harm to the communities and the environment, but also to do good by enhancing the environmental and social outcomes. The environmental and social safeguards is part of the GCF's environmental and social management system, which is a broad operational framework of GCF for environmental and social sustainability. Safeguards enable GCF and accredited entities to have a consistent approach to identifying and managing risks and impacts, and in setting the expectations on the environmental and social outcomes of GCF-funded projects. In this sense, safeguards allow institutions, including GCF, to answer questions such as, what are the environmental and social issues associated with the projects being proposed? What are the risks and potential impacts of the activities? How should the projects be designed, for example, to avoid and minimize the risk and impacts? What measures should be in place to mitigate this? Who should participate? What are the views of the affected communities? And what are the ways by which the projects will be able to receive and resolve issues and complaints? In 2014, the GCF adopted the IFC's Performance Standard for Environmental and Social Sustainability, or collectively called the Performance Standard, as its interim environmental and social safeguard standards. Following the IFC Performance Standard, the interim safeguards of GCF are composed of 8 component standards, with Performance Standard 1 as the overarching, or what we call the umbrella standard, because it covers the requirements for environmental and social assessments, risk management, mitigation of impacts in projects proposed for GCF funding. This standard also covers the institutional requirements for environmental and social management system, or the ESMS, of the different entities, and these are assessed as part of the accreditation of these entities. Performance standards 2 to 8 cover specific environmental and social issues that will need to be addressed in the design and implementation of projects. And these standards describe what should be considered in assessing and managing these specific environmental and social risks and impacts. As in any other management system, there are different roles that are played. Within the safeguards requirement of GCF-funded projects, the accredited entities have the primary role of ensuring that the due diligence is conducted including the identification and assessment of likely risks and impacts, the design of mitigation measures, the assignment of risk category, the conduct of consultation and continuing engagement of stakeholders, the disclosure of information, and putting in place the mechanisms for grievance redress, monitoring, and reporting of outcomes. The GCF, on the other hand, exercises a second-level due diligence by confirming the assessments done by the accredited entities and the consistency of this assessment with the GCF standards. GCF also validates the risk categories, ensuring the consultation, grievance redress mechanism, and disclosure of information to the board and the GCF public to occur. Countries are relied upon to confirm the consistency of the project with the ESS as well as the national requirements, and are counted upon also to facilitate the multi-stakeholder consultations and dialogues. The environmental and social risk management relies on a robust due diligence that starts from the initial identification of risk and potential impacts through a process called screening. An environmental and social screening is a preliminary process typically undertaken at the concept note stage, and that the screening determines the likely issues, risks, and potential impacts of a proposed projects or activities. The results of the screening will help define the level of environmental and social risk, or what we call the category of the project, and then the scope of any further assessments and the measures that will have to be developed and implemented. Depending on the level of risk and impacts identified during the screening, further assessments will provide the details of these risks and impacts and will inform the management and mitigation measures. These measures are contained in the project's environmental and social management plans or action plans that will be implemented with the project. Periodic monitoring will determine how the mitigation measures are implemented, and which will then feed into the continuing screening and assessment processes, and again, overall to achieve the effectiveness of the mitigation measures. There are three levels of or categories of risk for GCF-funded projects, and these are the high, the medium or moderate, and then the risk levels. And these are codified as Category A for high risk, Category B for medium or moderate risk, and Category C for low risk to none. And similarly, for projects that require intermediation, meaning that projects that would require a financial intermediary, for example, for on-lending projects, risk levels are classified as I1 for high level, I2 for moderate, and I3 for low risk to none. These risk categories of intermediated projects are based on the potential risk of the portfolio, which would then be composed of the component sub-projects and investee projects. The level of risk will determine the extent of due diligence of projects to ensure that appropriate resources are deployed to effectively manage the risks and impacts. Projects assessed to have significant adverse environmental and social risk, for example, projects that have the potential to convert critical habitats, will need to have a more robust and technically rigorous assessment of impacts on the habitats and biodiversity, and will have more stringent mitigation measures. Contrast this with projects with less significant risks and impacts, for example, those that involve family-scale food production or gardening, or production or installation of rainwater harvesting facilities or automatic weather stations, which may not need as rigorous assessments and management plans, but perhaps maybe a simple screening or management plans or action plans. As stated previously, risk categories will define the scope and determine the breadth, the depth, and extent of due diligence, mitigation measures, monitoring, and stakeholder consultations. Category A or I1 will require a comprehensive environmental and social impacts assessment, or what we call it as the ESIA, and also require the Environmental and Social Management Plan, or the ESMP. Category B or I2, on the other hand, will require a limited or focused environmental and social assessment, which are less comprehensive than those required for high-level or Category A projects, but however will require also the ESMPs. Category C or I3 will require an environmental and social risk screening, and as may be necessary, a management plan. Projects proposed for GCF financing under the SAP are those classified as having low to no environmental and social risk. Environmental and social due diligence requires significant level of effort in terms of, and also in terms of time, in preparing as well as reviewing the safeguards instrument, and particularly for projects classified as having moderate to significant environmental and social risk. These categories of project entail a rigorous due diligence process by both the accredited entity as the preparer of the safeguards document and the GCF as the one who's also reviewing the safeguards document. And so recognizing this, projects proposed for GCF funding under the SAP will only consider projects where the environmental and social risks and impacts have been established to be non to minimal. And this is necessary to ensure that the proposals are considered most expeditiously and without the need to have more detailed, rigorous due diligence and review as required of projects with higher environmental and social risk. And therefore, projects that are considered under SAP are those that have none to low level of risk and impacts, those that require a limited level of due diligence, for example, and just an environmental and social screening, and projects where the screening do not need any gathering of extensive baseline information as may be required for environmental and social assessments. The typology of potential projects are provided in the guidelines for preparing the safeguards of projects and the SAP. The list is by no means exhaustive. However, you will note that the typical projects include those that have limited footprints, those that trigger most of the requirements of the standards, for example, projects or activities that lead to physical or economic displacement, activities that adversely affect indigenous peoples or communities, activities that generate significant emissions to air, effluents or waste that may contaminate the ground or affect the public health, among others. Concept notes of projects proposed for GCF funding are required to undertake an environmental and social screening as a preliminary step to determine the likely environmental and social risks and impacts. The result of the screening will establish the risk category of the proposed projects and subsequently its eligibility for the simplified approval process. A two-part environmental and social screening is recommended for projects proposed under SAP. The first part, or Part A, establishes the safeguards eligibility for SAP. The screening under Part A identifies all the risk factors based on the GCF standards that would potentially raise the risk category of the project. Factors include activities that may lead to various environmental and social risks, such as involuntary resettlement or displacement, impacts on indigenous people or local population, generation of waste, pollution, etc. Further screening of the concept notes will then need to be undertaken under Part B of the screening tool for any low-level or residual environmental and social risks. Those identified low-level environmental and social risks and impacts are identified, and that an environmental and social action plan will be required to be submitted together with the funding proposal. The Environmental and Social Action Plan, or ESAP, will identify the specific actions or measures to avoid, minimize, or mitigate the risks and impacts, any further studies, any further due diligence requirements that will have to be met, the responsible persons or institutions, the timing of implementation measures, and the resources that will be needed. This sets the commitment of the accredited entity in ensuring that the project remains remains with a low level of risk and impacts. The result of the screening of concept notes will be reviewed by GCF and will confirm to the accredited entity the following: the eligibility of the projects to apply for SAP, recommendations on the SAP, and other measures to mitigate any low-level risks and impacts, and recommendations on the other requirements of the fund, for example, gender assessment, gender action plan, stakeholder engagement, as well as grievance redress mechanism. So in summary, when preparing the safeguards requirement for projects proposed under SAP, it is important to first establish an environmental and social risk category, ensuring that the proposed project will have low to no environmental and social risk and impacts overall, and also at the component activities or sub-projects. And this is done through the screening process. For proposals where specific locations may not have been identified at the time of submission, it is important to develop a list of excluded activities to define the type of activities that the project will fund and the types of activities that the project will not fund. Part A of the screening tool provides a basis for the development of such exclusion list. In the funding proposal, it will be important to provide not only the result of the screening, but also a description of the screening process undertaken. And lastly, keep in mind that the other requirements of GCF, such as those for, again, gender, stakeholder engagement, and grievance redress processes, will still have to be applied and to be described in the funding proposal. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Leo, for that very comprehensive and clear presentation of what is a complex issue, but one that is very important to this process. I think you have begun to clarify a lot of the different aspects for participants. There are a few questions that have come through. The first question asks, can a project about ecological waste recycling comply with the requirements of the SAP's risk avoidance policy? Strictly speaking, it doesn't generate any risks, but it deals with the environmental and health risks existent in the baseline scenario in order to alleviate them. Leo, please answer this question for our audience.
Thank you. Questions related to any specific projects. For example, this one is an interesting project idea, and I would say that I've not come across and I've not reviewed any project of this nature. But then again, for us to be able to confirm, for us to be that validate the risk category of these kinds of projects, we will need additional information. For example, the results of the screening, because there's so many variables that we will have to look at. Variables in terms of the scale of the project, variables in terms of the location of the project, and then also all the risk factors that are identified in the screening tool. Again, yes, probably, but we'll have to look into the result of the screening.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. The next specific question is, could the SAP provide financing for a large hydro project? Leo, please answer this question for our audience.
Thank you. And again, the idea of a low-risk environmental and a low-risk project would be that any of the risk factors are not included in the implementation of the project. Obviously, a large hydropower project would have some significant adverse risks and impacts, and therefore, I'm not saying that it's not eligible under GCF financing, but it's just that under the SAP and under the qualification of what is a low-risk, low environmental social risk project, it may not qualify. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Leo. Another question, and this one is specific to the process. Who is responsible for writing the Environmental and Social Action Plan, the ESAP, that you talked about in your presentation?
Thank you. The screening is usually done by the CRED entity. And so the results of the screening, particularly Part B, identifies what are the residual risks and impacts. And it's all these risks and impacts that will have to be managed. Now, the part of the responsibility of the CRED entity is to identify who will do what in terms of mitigating these risks and impacts. It's a simple table, it's a simple matrix that will have to be developed and formulated by the CRED entity, discussed with the GCF Secretariat, where we agree on what would be the parameters of the mitigation measures. Primarily, it's a responsibility for CRED entity, but GCF Secretariat can also provide advice, can provide guidance on further mitigation measures. Thank you.
Thank you, Leo. Our next question asks, the ESS considers 8 standards. How many standards will need to be complied with by the implementing entity? Or is this considered on a project-by-project basis? Leo, can you help us with that question?
Sure. Not all projects trigger all the specific safeguard standards. And primarily, safeguard standards are triggered where there are the requirements that need to be met by a project. For example, a project on large hydro, for example, or let's take another example, agroforestry, for instance. This would be the kind of projects that would typically trigger a performance standard. Of course, performance standard 1, performance standard 5 on land requirements, performance standard 6 on biodiversity and natural habitats. And so therefore, it differs. One project may trigger all the safeguards standards, or a project may just trigger 1 or 2 or 3 safeguard standards. In some of the classification criteria that have been used by the other accredited entities, where all the different performance standards have been triggered, meaning that there are diverse environmental and social risks. Some of these kinds of projects are classified as category A. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Leo. And there may be other questions that that come in the following time of the webinar that are related to the ESS, and we'll pass those on to you, because now I'd like to move on to our next section, where we will be presenting a case study. We'll have the opportunity now to see a video that shows us the experience of the Namibia Environment Investment Fund and their application process to the SAP. To introduce this video, I'd like to invite Patrick van Laak, the Ecosystems Management Senior Specialist at the GCF Secretariat, to tell us a little bit about the experience, give us some background, and to launch the video for us. Hello, Patrick. Thank you for joining us. And I give the mic to you to tell us about this very interesting project.
Thank you, Anna Maria, and welcome to all participants in this webinar. So I would like to give you the overview of the first case that we had with the SAP, and this is a project that was brought to the Secretariat by the Environmental Investment Fund of Namibia. The Environmental Investment Fund is a direct access entity. They have already had two projects approved prior to the SAP. And when they first learned about the SAP opportunity, they were very quick to respond. And they were, in fact, the first direct access entity, or the first entity overall, to submit a concept note for a SAP proposal only a few days after the SAP was first launched on the 11th of November of last year. The concept note was subsequently assessed by the Secretariat, and EIF proceeded to submit a full funding proposal, which was then passed through all the internal checks in the Secretariat and presented to the board at their last meeting at the end of February, and they indeed approved it. So overall, between the launch of the SAP on the 11th of November and the approval of the proposal on the 28th of February, only about 104 days have passed, and this was indeed a record and a very strong indication of how the SAP is making the processing quicker for funding proposals. Now I'm trying to go to my next slide. There we go. So you see there the magic number, SAP 001. So this is the first proposal. This is for the Kunene region in northwest Namibia, where EIF has proposed a project for rangeland management to deal with lesser precipitation and less reliable precipitation. And this is, of course, an issue which is prevalent in many areas of Africa. And this area is predominantly farmed by local communities with depending on livestock, but also having annual crops for their subsistence farming. So the proposed project has three components. First, looking at cost-effective investments in early warning systems to make the existing network of climate information systems and early warning systems available to the local communities in the region. The second component is focusing on disaster risk reduction options for drought management to make sure that the cattle has a better chance of surviving prolonged periods of drought. And then lastly, there is a component on the knowledge and information generation and dissemination making sure that all the lessons learned can be shared with a broader audience. Now, I'd like to stop talking here and to go over to a video which shows you in about 8 minutes the general structure of the EIF and their initial experience with the SAP. After this video, I'm available to answer any questions that you might have for with regards to the processing of this first SAP proposal. But first, the video. Here we go.
The Environmental Investment Fund of Namibia is a special state vehicle for resource mobilization for investments into the environmental sector, targeting investments into areas such as natural resource management and utilization, green technology, tourism, and research. The ultimate goal is to support environmentally and climate change resilient development pathways in Namibia. The Environmental Investment Fund became the first Namibian entity to be accredited to the Green Climate Fund in 2015, paving the way for increased investments into climate resilience and adaptation in the country. Accredited as a direct access entity, the fund had by mid-2017 accessed just under $20 million in climate financing for 2 projects on behalf of the Ministry of Agriculture, Water and Forestry and Ministry of Environment and Tourism respectively. This was done through the normal track, which, notwithstanding the urgent need for financing, still fell short of climate financing needs in other sectors of the Namibian economy.
The decision taken by the Green Climate Fund was received with high optimism from the Environmental Investment Fund as an accredited entity and the National Designated Authority, which is the Ministry of Environment and Tourism, a ministry under the Republic of Namibia. The decision itself signals an intent and commitment from the Green Climate Fund to support urgent actions in line with the COF as alluded in the Paris Agreement. As a country, the decision came on a perfect time, as we thought we had a very good pipeline of projects that fit within the criteria of the simplified approval process. Our experience with the direct access processes have proved to be stringent and to be challenging in terms of accessing resources from the GCF. As a country, we also felt that we are running out of time, as a lot of our communities are heavily impacted by the impacts of climate change. As a result, there's urgent action and a call from our government to provide solutions and interventions that enhance capacity of our communities. Considering our accreditation scope to the Green Climate Fund, our pipelines are well within the simplified approval process guidelines. They are presenting a huge transformational impact in terms of potential, and also they are of paradigm shift to a climate resilience pathway. Secondly, they are also within the micro funding scope, that is $10 million, and projects that are within the category C of the environmental and social safeguards. The Namibian government and the Environmental Investment Fund, as an accredited entity, chose to submit this particular project through the simplified approval process because it presented a high low-hanging fruits and it was of interest from the stakeholders and the government at large. The project aims to address the vulnerability of small-scale farmers under the condition of climate change by supporting ecosystem-based adaptation and early warning systems that promote resilient farming in the Kunene region. It is implemented in 3 localities, that is Sesfontein, Framkwel, and Fransfontein. The 3 areas are situated in the Kunene region of Namibia. an area that is home to close to 85,000 people, whose livelihood depends mainly on subsistence agriculture and ecosystem services. This is also an area that is highly susceptible to drought, and climate change has over the last few years worsened this problem. The interventions planned for the project are the adaptation of rangeland management techniques that will reduce the vulnerabilities of the farming communities in those three areas.
The direct access approval process has actually been a process in which we've learned to do quite a lot with the little resources that we had at the fund to develop proposals that address climate action, particularly adaptation in Namibia. The Secretariat's decision to develop the simplified approval process has given the fund a wider scope to actually look at projects that are actually prioritized by the government and that speak to national development goals. At the moment, the project development team learned that the concept note to fill in, for example, was quite short, very straight to the point, and it really suited our project development team. They worked in tandem in such a short time, to the extent that by the time we started to get the no objection from the National Designated Authority in December last year, we were able to submit this proposal in February, which is real record time. Small projects in the areas of the Kunene region, particularly areas that are heavily impacted by climate change, such as Kunene, the southern regions in Namibia, where farmers actually grapple to come to terms with the negative impacts of climate change, have been learning and have been yearning for assistance in the areas of climate adaptation. It is therefore an opportunity that the EIF has grasped with both hands to ensure that we provide and mobilize resources and direct them to those that need them the most in this country. And these are really the people with smallhold farmers, women, young people in the rural areas that need most of this assistance. So through this SAP, we're really happy to participate. We are proud to be the first successful applicant to a simplified approval process project, and we couldn't thank the Green Climate Fund Secretariat more.
My contribution to the project concept note with regard to the submission on the environmental social safeguard is more really to look at what are the impact or the socio-environmental impact in terms of the proposed activity to the project. Of course, take into consideration that this is not a full feasibility study in terms of ESS, but of course touching on key activities and see if they have or assess as per the assessment checklist by the GCF. What we want to see in here is that most of these activities should have, if any, minimum impact on socio-environmental issues. Gender is one of the key issues that the GCF actually look at for any submission, be it a full proposal or a concept note through the SAP. Of course, we are not doing a full gender assessment as it's required in the full proposal. However, for the SAP, still an assessment on gender have to be taken. However, the difference here is that this is quite a brief assessment in relation to the proposed activity. So any identified, be it a gap, be it certain elements that need to be addressed during the project implementations, are actually taken up so that we include those in the gender action plan, which have now to be implemented during the project implementation. So as a sensitive area to the GCF, we make sure that each project proposal or concept note have a gender action attached to it.
I would like to use this opportunity to thank the Secretariat of the Green Climate Fund whose support has been second to none. The turnaround, in terms of technical support and guidance and in directing our proposal was much appreciated, and we thank the Green Climate Fund for this support.
Fantastic. I really enjoy seeing that case study because I think it really illuminates us on the procedure, but makes it a real life situation where we can see how the SAP is being put to great use at the country level. So Patrick, I have a question for you here that it's interesting in that it addresses the Namibia case study and also reflects on the previous presentation that we heard by Leo. The question is, regarding the case study of Namibia, what are the environmental safeguard risks and what are the main activities that are proposed to mitigate them? Could you give us some thoughts on this particular question?
Yes, of course. This is a very interesting question. It of course also comes back to the presentation that Leo gave. By definition, the sub-projects have little to no environmental and social risks. If they do have the risks, then you have to go through the regular procedure. That said, every sub-project has certain activities where we must assess what their impacts are on the environment, on the social issues. In the model that we use in the GCF in working with organizations like the Environmental Investment Fund of Namibia, we associate with these accredited entities after we have assessed their capacity to deal with these kinds of residual impacts. So on the one hand, the proposal is not having any significant environmental and social risks, and secondly, we trust in the abilities of the accredited entity to deal with these. But perhaps, Leo, if I can invite you to add some more detail here.
Thank you, Patrick. So the proposal provided by the EIF identified some of the residual or what we may consider low-level social and environmental risks for which they've developed an environmental and social action plan. Among those that they've identified include some potential for human or wildlife conflict due to competition for resources, especially along the fringes of some of the pasture land, as well as the native conservation areas. There were also some issues related to labor, for example, practices and influx of labor into a particular work site. There were also some issues related to waste generation, especially during construction of the small-scale village-level infrastructure, and also potential introduction of non-native species in their revegetation activities. They identified also lack of community engagement as a potential social risk, preventing the buy-in of the communities in the project. And all these kinds of risks, they've developed an action plan for which they've described how they intend to address these kinds of risks. And the social action plan have been costed. They've identified who will be doing what and at what particular time frame. Over.
Thank you, Leo, for adding your experience and knowledge to that question. Patrick, another question here from the audience that is quite interesting. The participant asks, how does a project proponent avoid having the gender assessment in the SAP be just a check the box activity, since it's only such a brief assessment? Could you give us a little bit more background on that aspect of the process?
Yeah, of course. It's a very funny question because basically I can tell the participants how they can circumvent the procedures of the GCF by not submitting the documents. But I'll actually say here that the project is not supposed to have any risks related to gender, but you are still required to submit a gender action plan, because not only are we looking at mitigating negative impacts, we're also trying to actively, let's say, foster good developments or promote certain developments. And the gender issue is one of them. So in either case, you are required to submit a gender assessment and a gender action plan. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick, for explaining that part of the process to us. So a final question here. Could you tell us a little bit more about what kinds of comments and feedback did the GCF Secretariat provide at the initial stages of EIF's SAP submission process? I give it to you.
Okay, so basically a SAP is not very different from a regular funding proposal. So when we first received the concept note, we review the proposed intervention, so the rationale, the paradigm shift, the climate change impacts, the structure of the project in components, subcomponents, activities, etc. And then we provide that feedback to the accredited entity. And this is always done in a very constructive way. So we're not trying to be judges and juries here. We're trying to be a partner of the proposal developers to help you develop a project that is actually amenable to funding by the Green Climate Fund, and which is going to deliver a positive impact in your country. The same goes with the funding proposal. So we will be discussing with you on issues like the logical framework, the budget, the environmental assessments, gender issues, indigenous peoples issues, sustainability over the long term, both in terms of the impact and in terms of the financial sustainability. And so it's the whole multi-dimensional aspects of the funding proposal. And again, we do this to help you, not to try to make you stumble.
Great, thank you for that explanation, Patrick. So that is really quite a wonderful experience that the GCF SAP team has had as they're to kick off the what I'm sure is going to be a slew of really fantastic projects that you have in the future. There are quite a number of questions that came through. There's one that I believe would be particularly well suited for Dimitra to answer. So I just ask Dimitra to chime in here. The question from our participant is, could you please provide an example of a project? I was switched to a new question, but let me ask this one anyways, and then we'll go back to the other. Would you please provide this example of a project that combines specialized fiduciary standards, considering on lending and blending, as well as technical assistance? Is that something that you could help us get with Dimitrio?
Yes, no, thank you for this question. Actually, if we are talking about SAP projects, only one, as Patrick just mentioned, have been approved, and it doesn't have any blending instrument. It's a grant. It's a grant instrument mainly provided by the Green Climate Fund. What we see in terms of SAP that we have in the pipeline is that actually we have only public sector projects, not private sector for the moment, but SAP it's open also to private sector, which normally is more geared towards having blending instead of one single financial instrument. But for the moment, the pipeline of concept note that we have are for public sector, and they all ask grants to GCF. In general, I can say that on the website there are all the approved projects of the GCF. Normally the one that go for medium to large scale, they employs loans which are at different level of seniority, senior, subordinate level loans, and they use blending with grants that normally cover the part on technical assistance. These are typical, maybe larger mitigation projects, like comes to my mind one project from the Inter-American Development Bank in geothermal that use a combination of loans and a component of grants that cover the technical assistance part of the project. In this sense, it's a bit similar to what multilateral development banks So I hope that this answers your question. Over to you, Anna Maria.
Thank you, Demetrio. And thank you again, Patrick, for presenting that case study for us and for bringing us that wonderful video. There are a number of questions that came through, some of them technical. I know that there may have been a few participants who had difficulty with the video, either viewing it or with the audio, and we apologize for that. The video, however, will be available to you afterwards. It's part of the recorded webinar that you will receive a link to, and I understand that the GCF will make it available also on their website in the coming days, and we'll be sending you a link to that so that you can view the video, those who were unable to, or if you'd like to see it again, share it with colleagues and friends who might also be interested in learning about this experience. This has been a really fulfilling and interesting session. We got to hear some of the history of the SAP as it's come into being, how it works, and its different components, and most importantly, how an interested project proponent can apply for funding through the SAP. What are the different eligibility criteria and the specific steps that are required to prepare and present a project. We also got to understand better what the environmental and social safeguards are under the GCF and what their relevance is to the SAP, how to determine if your project falls within the low risk category, making it an eligible project for SAP funding. And finally, we heard from an on-the-ground project, the Namibia experience, and we got to see the process that they went through and learn about where they were coming from and how they got there to their successful SAP-funded project. It's been really quite interesting and dynamic, and what a pleasure and a treat to work with this wonderful team at the GCF. So now I'd like to come back to Demetrio, the manager of the SAP division, to share with us some concluding remarks. Demetrio, welcome back, and please give us your words of wisdom and share some final ideas and thoughts with our audience today. I'll be back after Demetrio just for a couple administrative matters, but I leave it in your hands to close the substantive portion of our webinar. Demetrio, it's all yours.
Thank you, Anna Maria. And maybe I'm not sure I can share word of wisdom, but surely I can share a big thank from the GCF to all of you that you have demonstrated interest and you have joined us for this webinar, on the first webinar on the simplified approval process. Thank you very much for your insightful questions. And first of all, I hope that this type of exchanges and learning experiences can actually support the fact that more SAP proposal will come to GCF and of good quality, and that we were able to give you, if not a full comprehensive view on what is the SAP, at least the elements that can really be instrumental to you to know more how this process works and how the GCF works. Possibly, unfortunately, given the time availability, we might have not be able to reply to all the questions that you have asked. Actually, with UNITAR, we will work to consolidate the questions that were not answered during this webinar, and we will try our best to come back to you with a reply in writing through UNITAR. And please be in touch with the Green Climate Fund. We have a website where there is a section, a web page dedicated to the simplified approval process. You can find more information there, and you can be in touch with us through the website and through a dedicated email. Let me also say that today, with this final session, we have made a little bit of history, because this is the first time that the Green Climate Fund is actually using the webinar as modality to do outreach and capacity building, and we are sure this is not the last time. We plan actually to offer more webinars in collaboration with UNITAR. We see if it's possible to offer these webinars also on not only in English but also in French or Spanish or other languages, so that we are able to outreach better those not English-speaking partners and countries. I just wanted to say my final words as a thank to the UNITAR team, to you, Anna Maria, and to Elena and to Angus behind the scene that help us to organize this webinar. My really special thank goes to the Environmental Investment Fund, the EIF of Namibia, for their kind contribution with the video. This comes from them, and we are really grateful. Thank you very much. You will find also this video on the GCF website, on the SAP webpage. And finally, my thanks really goes to the GCF colleagues here, to Jenny, Leo, and Patrick, and most of all to my colleague here, Katie, which behind the scene was the mastermind without who this webinar could not have taken place. So that I wish to all of you a good continuation of your day, of your afternoon, of your night, such as for us in Korea, and see you soon to the next webinar. Thank you, and over to you, Anna Maria.
Thank you very much, Demetrio. And I think the audience heard your words of invitation that they should stay in touch with your team, and that you are quite accessible and interested in hearing from them. And we shared on the presentation the website through which they can contact you. I also want to extend my thanks to the UNCC Learn team for their role in putting the session together. Elena in particular, her tireless work at making sure that all the technical parts worked as well as possible. The recording of the webinar will be available and sent to you via link in a follow-up email. It may take up to a couple of weeks for us to have it prepared so that you can share it with others or review it for your own purposes. And as Demetrio mentioned, we will do our best to answer all of the questions that you sent in, although time may not have allowed the presenters to answer them individually during the webinar. Thanks to all of our wonderful presenters, Demetrio, Gianni, Leo, and Patrick. Thanks also goes out to the Namibia project team for making that fantastic video that really brought all of the components and features to a real live situation that we could understand better. And thanks to all of the participants for being with us today. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's a pleasure to provide these types of webinars for you, and we look forward to hearing from you and working with you in the future. Now I will ask the participants to just take a couple more moments to fill out an exit survey. Once the webinar concludes, a survey will pop up on your screen similar to the one that you filled out at the beginning, and that will help us to fine-tune all of the different aspects of the webinar so that we can make them better and better for you into the future. So thanks again to everyone. Have a wonderful remainder of your day or evening, and take care. Goodbye.